This week on Dialogue, Choke Point, the world's looming water crisis. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Now let's meet our guests. Jennifer Turner is director of the Wilson Center's China Environment Forum. Keith Schneider is senior editor for Circle of Blue. He previously served as a New York Times national correspondent. Welcome to Dialogue. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Let's start with some of the preliminaries. I'll ask you about Circle of Blue and you about the China Environment Forum, and then we'll learn about this project you're working on together. Keith?
Circle Blue is an online news organization based in northern Michigan. We have a small staff. We do global reporting on the freshwater crisis, and our focus right now is looking at the confrontation between energy, water, and agriculture globally. So we've been to Australia, we've been to Mexico, we've been to China, we've been to Europe to look at, and the United States to look at this confrontation between resources that's becoming more intense as the world's population grows and the world's wealth, particularly in Asia, grows. And this is one of the probably the most important resource confrontation, producing all kinds of political effects around the world, including the Arab Spring.
Now, Keith, when you were with the New York Times before you joined Circle of Blue,
I was.
Writing on a lot of things, how did this become an area of expertise?
Well, I've been an environmental journalist my entire life, my entire adult life, more than 30 years. I was at the Times as a full-time correspondent between 85 and 95, and since then I've been writing as a contract writer, and this area of energy, water, and agriculture has just been part of that environmental. Well, right now it is this is the political story, the political economic story on the planet.
Jennifer, tell us about the China Environment Forum.
Well, the China Environment Forum has been at the Wilson Center for 14 years, so we're a solid teenager. And I've been here 12, and we really serve the global practitioners that focus on energy and environmental issues in China. And over the years, we've done a lot on water and energy, and I'm more of a water person. That's how I started my studies in grad school and whatnot.
So you've been with this a long time.
Yeah, I used to English teacher back in China in 1987. So hanging out in China for a long time, but also very concerned about the environment. So I really, for a number of years, have wanted to try to bring the water and energy issue together, and didn't find anyone in my network who was working on this. And then Circle Blue, Keith Schneider, and these guys produced this Choke Point U.S. report, and I jumped up and down and said, hey, this is what we need to do in China. And we were able to raise some funds, and I was able to send Keith and a team of about 8 other journalists and photographers to China to cover 10 provinces to dig out a story that no one had ever looked at before.
So now we have Choke Point U.S. and Choke Point China.
Yep.
What is the concept of Choke Point? What are we talking about?
Again, the most important confrontation over resources in the world right now is between agriculture, food production, energy production, and water. And water is the limiting resource for both. And as demand for agriculture and energy rises, the water demand. So energy and agriculture are the 2 largest users of water on the planet. And in the places that are growing the fastest in the United States and in China are the places that are both producing the most energy and, very important, in the food production, and in our west and in their north. The United States is west and China's north. The water reserves are falling.
If you were slicing this into a pie chart, what percentage of the pie do U.S. and China represent as far as the problem?
China represents 80% of the problem.
80%?
Right, because China's economy is growing so fast.
But wait a second, you always hear that the United States is the consumer, the world's consumer per capita of most things.
No longer. China is the largest energy producer. China is the largest climate change gas producer. China has the largest markets for every commodity that you know. China is the 2nd largest economy. It will be the largest economy within the next 10, 12 years, depending upon what's happening in the United States. China is the show in the 21st century.
So we are old news.
Oh, no, I would say old news. Yeah.
No, I, of course, overstated. But let me ask you this. I know these are difficult things to quantify, but just trying to, the notion of a water crisis. If, a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being everything is humming along perfectly and all resources and usage are in balance, and 10 being we are on the verge of something catastrophic, where does the world sit right now in regards to water? How severe an issue is this?
Well, I think that, on the water energy choke point, China is already hitting them. And I mean,
So where are they on that scale of 1 to 10? If 10 is catastrophe,
7.
8, 7, 8,
It's that,
7, 8, yeah.
that far down the tracks.
And will only grow worse as climate change impacts glaciers and weather patterns in China. I mean, what's notable is that the Chinese government, they've acknowledged that the threat of climate change, and they've been implementing a lot of clean energy policies over the past 6 years in particular, that investing twice as much in clean energy as the U.S., trying to bring down their CO2 emissions. But their growth is so fast, their energy is growing so quickly that they're really only just cutting down about half of the new CO2 emissions with the measures that they've taken.
When you both mentioned energy, are we essentially more fundamentally, are we talking about population growth? Is that what drives the energy consumption? Is it a population growth issue?
Right. Well, the world right now is which fanned its hand at clean energy development, is in this incredible new boom on fossil fuel development. Coal, oil, natural gas. It's true in the United States, it's true in China. Those use tremendous amounts of water, both to develop, process, and transport. Our choke point in the United States is developing significantly in the northern Great Plains, where North Dakota is now the 4th largest oil producing state in the country, also one of the driest. China's choke point on energy is in their northern Yellow River Basin, where they produce 70% of their coal. And it's in a desert region. So China is looking at a 20 billion cubic meter deficit in water. They're going to be 20 billion cubic meters short of water by the end of this decade. And I have one more point about how this is working. In 1950, we produced 37 quadrillion BTUs of energy. And it took us 57 years until 2007 to get to 100 quads of energy. China produced 35 billion quads of energy in 1995. And they were already over 100 by 2007. So they have more than tripled their energy production and use in 15 years. 15 years. It took us 57 years to do the same.
While China does have, a large population, the bigger issue, I mean, their population growth has slowed down considerably over the past 30 years, but it's this shift of trying to urbanize. The government has a goal of urbanizing another 350 million people. And it's not that the individuals will be consuming more energy, but it's also just the stuff, the roads, the cement, the steel, all very water intensive
And there's
industries.
not a city on the planet that receives enough water. It has to bring it from somewhere else, right? It doesn't just fall from the sky in the form of rain. Every city needs to supplement from somewhere else.
In China.
In the world.
In the world, that's true.
I think that's what I've read. I mean, you're the experts, but
well, in the United States,
it was something that stuck out to me because it took me by surprise when I thought that the notion was that cities, just because by their nature, are going to consume more water than available sources right there within the city.
But municipal water supply, the supply to cities is not the significant choke point. Agriculture in China is using well over half water. In the United States, it's 80% of use is agriculture.
80% in the U.S.
80% of use. So agriculture is the huge water user, but energy is the second biggest water user. But because our energy demand is growing so fast, particularly in Asia, and it's growing in a country that is basically a desert, and their principal energy reserves, the coal that they need to develop, is being developed in the desert. So they don't have enough water to expand the energy production that they're anticipating.
And does coal in particular need more water than other forms of energy to process?
Yes, in China, because
is it cleaning the coal? What is
cleaning the coal, processing the coal, combusting the coal, cooling the coal, power plants. That all is they use their coal also for gasifying to produce chemicals. So they gasify it. It takes 20 gallons or 30 gallons for every gallon that they're producing. So it's just a very intensive water consumption industry in a region that just doesn't have a lot of water. And the other piece of this, the choke point with agriculture, that same Yellow River Basin produces 20% of China's grain.
Which now in northern China is 40% dependent on groundwater. And so, I mean, there's proposals in China that, I mean, and I love China in this way, but they say, well, maybe we need to move this breadbasket, right, to the northeast where there is more water.
More water.
Which, but they're moving. Speaking of moving water, they're building giant canals from southern China, from the Yangtze River Basin, the South North Water Transfer Project, to move water from the water-rich south to the north, to not only supply the cities, but also when there's a huge line that it'll take decades to complete, but that is aimed to move from the southwest China up to northwest to get to the coal mines.
Well, then that raises the question, is the problem that we don't have enough water, or that we don't have enough water where we need the water?
Both.
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 China.
In China. What about globally?
Depends. It's very region specific.
Mm-hmm.
So Australia, also a desert region, desert country, next to China, the driest country. Its energy reserves also are in the north. It has no water.
What about all that ocean around there? Is there a scenario? Do we have technology where we can convert salt water to these freshwater usages?
Well, desalination is one of the largest industrial development sectors in the world right now. Huge numbers of plants are being built.
And does it hold promise?
It's very expensive and it's very energy intensive at the moment. So it can solve urban issues, as in Melbourne, built a big desalination plant. The problem is that those desalination plants take so much energy. They're being powered by coal-fired power plants. In Australia, it's very dirty coal, so you're increasing your climate change gases, which is producing drier conditions both in Australia. So we have this negative feedback loop.
We've been doing a lot of math on this program, which as a rule I try to avoid in life and in television, but let me share these numbers that you know, but it might be very interesting to our viewers and listeners. Water covers more than 70% of the earth, we know that, but only 2.5% of that is fresh water, and 2/3 of that is locked in ice caps and glaciers. And I know there's a joke in there about we might be taking care of that, but then here's the bottom line, which I found stunning. In reading materials in preparation to speaking with both of you today, the accessible fresh water is 0.006% of the total water on the planet. That's a stunning figure.
Right. And in China, much of what they have available is too polluted to use.
Yeah.
The climate change overlay, we haven't talked about it specifically, but clearly it looms large in this conversation. How does that exacerbate the problems that we're talking about?
Well, in southern China, right, remember the water-rich south? Over the past 2 years, they've experienced 4 severe droughts. And one of the other non-coal solutions for energy in China, being pushed quite hard, is our dams. I mean, China has the largest number of dams of any country in the world, and they're going to have more. In the most recent 12th five-year plan, they're saying that they're going to build another 60 dams. But right now, in the past, particularly in this last year, because of all these droughts, a lot of the existing dams were anywhere from 50 to 30 to 20% where they, of the normal reservoir. And so there were a lot of brownouts in a lot of cities in China, but they do have the one solution they've come up with is that now when you build a dam, you always are going to build a coal-fired power plant next to it, because once you start supplying a city or a factory with whatever this energy is, you have to keep supplying it. And so there's another shift that we discovered in our research and reporting, was that the coal transport is starting to move, instead of just going out to the East Coast, has to go further south, or they also just simply mine extremely dirty coal in the southwestern part of China. So it's a lot of complex confrontations with infrastructure.
Is this an oversimplification to say that the early returns on this climate change question are that where it's dry, it's made it drier, and where it's wet, it's made it wetter?
Yes, with caveats.
Sure.
Yeah.
The models predict much more intensive storms. We're seeing that in the United States. The models predict longer, deeper droughts. We're seeing that. But the more they know, the more complex it goes, the more scientists don't know about this. But the basic models show that we're getting drier. That's clear in our Southwest. We're getting hotter. That's clear in this country, and it's clear in China. It's clear in the equatorial regions. We're losing moisture at the higher elevations, so Mount Kilimanjaro, snows of Mount Kilimanjaro disappearing. Of course, we all know about what's happening at the poles. The problem is that the solutions are not apparent to us, because as our energy demand rises, we're feeding it with fossil fuels, both in the United States and China and around the world. We have a new fossil fuel boom.
Why the fossil fuel boom at a time where everybody's talking about renewable energy or green economies? I mean, I think that would come as a surprise to a lot of people if they were polled on whether we're increasing fossil fuel production or decreasing. You're saying there's this boom. It seems to run contrary to a lot of the political discourse.
The discussion here delves deep looked into the politics and culture of both countries. In the United States, there's been a significant investment by the fossil fuel industry, which is our largest industry, natural gas, oil, the utilities, the railroads, the coal mines. That's a very powerful political bloc who's made significant investments in reserves, natural gas, oil, and coal that they choose to develop. And there is a political, I'm going to be kind about this, there's a political view that climate change is a hoax and we don't need to prepare for it. And that clean energy is subsidized at too high a level. China isn't into that. China is like all of the above. China is needs so much energy. It's going to triple the amount of electricity, double the amount of electricity that it uses today by the next 10 years. It's going to increase its coal production from 3 billion metric tons to 4 billion metric tons by the end of the decade. And it is producing, it's going to triple, almost quadruple the amount of clean energy, that is non-fossil fuel energy that it's producing. Jennifer talked about hydro. Well, it's also got very large wind, very large solar development, and other alternatives, biofuels, biomass, a little bit. Nuclear, it's got a major nuclear energy development program. So it's going to go from 213 megawatts, 213 gigawatts of power to over 780 gigawatts of power in a decade. If that was the United States, that'd be 80% of our generating capacity.
I want to take out a giant highlighter so everybody pays attention to what we just talked about here. That the land of the free, the home of the brave, is in this political denial about climate change, and the great communist power remaining on the planet is full steam ahead in addressing the problem. That's the way the world's turned inside out.
Well, but they also, in China, they've also seen though that the pollution from coal, that the cost that it was having on human health and the economy, that it was just too great. Overall, estimates are that pollution in China is costing them anywhere from 7 to 10% of GDP. And so, so it's huge. And in China, the government and the Communist Party, they need economic growth to continue their legitimacy and move things forward. And so it's a matching that they need it for the growth, but they also see that climate change is having an impact in China.
And in terms of water production, with the exception of hydro, the others don't use water. Are essentially water free. So that they're developing their basis for solar and wind in their desert regions, the same Yellow River. They don't have a pushback politically to this. When we were there in December, we visited some of their major manufacturing bases, 20,000 jobs, making rotors and towers and wind components for wind areas that are building 2,000, 2,500 windmills a year now. In the United States, we not only have this political view that climate change is a hoax and clean energy is too expensive to subsidize. At the grassroots in the United States, people aren't accepting these big projects. So all over the country, there's this major pushback.
Right, we're not in the big business or big projects business anymore.
Yeah,
dams.
People just don't want them in their backyards. They don't want the solar in the desert. They don't want I live in an area where there's been significant political unrest over big wind projects.
Well, given all of this, speaking of choke points, what's the way out? Where are there signs of hope? I've read that Las Vegas, for example, has been a shining example of progress in that the population has gone up by almost 500,000, but water consumption has actually dropped.
And we're seeing, if you look at the federal government's view of water use in the United States, we're static or going down in terms of water consumption. That's both because of conservation, it's also because we're using less energy. But we're going to see more issues like this. Atlanta 2 years ago had a major drought and very large confrontations between the power sector, which needs the water to cool the plants, and the municipalities. We're seeing it out in the Southwest all over as new coal production it confronts agriculture and municipal water use. So, and of course in the Great Plains we're going to see a very significant, in our view, very significant confrontation between the ag sector and the energy sector in an area that's one of the driest in the United States.
Speaking of confrontation, you play this out in almost a science fiction scenario, but as we know, often science fiction becomes the future. Are we talking about water wars in the future in the worst case scenario? Are there going to be conflicts between countries that could be military conflicts over water?
My view of this differs from many scholar journalists that have looked at this. We've had small skirmishes around the world over water, almost tribal in parts of Africa. But my view is that if we were going to have a water war, we would have had it. For instance, Palestine Jordan, Palestine, and Israel have very significant water negotiations that they're not interested in discussing publicly, that they've worked out agreements to use the Jordan River, which is whose reserves are diminishing as well, in a way that has kept the peace over water. We'd have seen it at other places too. So my sense is that the losers in a water war are so, I mean, that the loss is so dire that people just don't want to think about fighting wars over water, and the solutions are within our grasp. I mean, it's a matter of conservation, different kinds of uses, different energy mixes, pulling water out of agriculture. We can solve it. If there is going to be a water war, and I'm not saying that, if the place that's one of the hottest places is right now between India and China over the water that's coming from the Himalayas into India.
Because the Chinese want to dam the rivers that flow into the Brahmaputra, but also even the water transfer project I mentioned, moving water, when they start building that transfer way out west in China, which up in Tibet, transferring water to the north, that's also taking water out of what we call the Tibetan water tower. That's water that supplies billions of people, further downstream in South and Southeast Asia. But it's, but India, you're right, India's very upset with China. But again, that said, the Chinese are now starting to acknowledge that, okay, maybe we should be communicating with India about our plans. And that's very new for China, because usually the Chinese policy has been any kind of dam, we're upstream, no conversation.
Keith, you mentioned that you differ with other experts in the field on this. Are there those who fear that this could end up in military confrontation?
It's a popular conversation in the media because it agitates and it inspires coverage. But
guilty as charged.
We've not seen it, and there's nothing in our reporting. Now, we've looked at this hard. There's nothing in our reporting that indicates that nations can't solve this diplomatically.
Well, with that in mind, and that's some good news here, is we talked about climate change, which has become hyper-politicized in parts of the world, certainly in this country. What about discussions of water? Do they fall into that political, he said, she said kind of camp? Or right now, is there much more reliance on actual science?
Well, I mean, I know that, and he'll know more details, but I know that out in the western U.S., that there's some, politically it may not be cool to talk about climate change, but they are talking about water energy confrontations. The Western Governors Association has a working group on water and energy, and Great Lakes region also starting to look at water energy confrontations. Some of it too is also, in the U.S., there's also the issue of how much energy water uses to move it, to clean it. That's the other side of the nexus, and that's possibly a bigger discussion here.
We have compacts, legal agreements between states, and in the Great Lakes region between states and Canada. So we have compacts that have been in place a long time to negotiate these kinds and anticipate, and they're working pretty well. In the Midwest states negotiate a compact to protect the Great Lakes from withdrawals. Now, if the energy industry really wants to move on Lake Superior, who knows? Around the world, similar kinds of agreements are occurring. I mentioned the Jordanians, the Palestinians, and Israel have an agreement about how to share the Jordan River's water. Will it get worse? Yeah, it's going to get worse.
Before it gets better.
It is.
Well, you've both mentioned, though, that there are solutions. This is not an unsolvable problem. Well, then, what are the barriers? Why aren't we addressing the problems more aggressively?
Well, in China, first of all, because we want to make sure that we don't come off as gloom and doom, that in China we did see, besides, stressing renewable energies that are water sipping, that we came across some, experiments at the local level where coal-fired power plants and factories were being built in the Yellow River Basin, and they were starting to build them, and then the province wouldn't give them any water allocation because they said, we've already allocated. And these factories will turn then to the farmers and say, hey, we'll help install, we'll cement your canals, we'll give you some water efficient technologies and sell us your water, which officially is illegal in China, but it's been made a pilot project. And because, the Chinese are very pragmatic. And we've also seen that steel plants that without top-down requirements have started recycling a lot of their water. And now it's in the 12th five-year plan. So the central government is starting to recognize now that they need to take a very comprehensive approach to water, like they did for the clean energy stuff. And it's tougher, right? I mean, because having to regulate and make sure that people clean the water and conserve the water, it's a lot more work.
This is high. This is a very high priority politically in China because they're a desert country that's growing so fast and know that they're facing a very significant impediment in terms of water availability because their reserves are declining mostly because of climate change. In the U.S., it's a different problem. I mean, in the U.S., this is a problem that we're a nation that no longer can face up to how to solve really, really big problems. We've decided to punt on this and other problems. This is part of the mix of what's happening in the United States. At the local level, we have more success. Municipalities are conserving. Industries are conserving. People are using less. Agriculture is very aware that it needs to be able to conserve in the central part of the country where the Ogallala is. The energy industry, it's unclear. I mean, they use a lot of water to develop these new deep shales and natural shale oil and gas. And where the energy industry is coming down on this is, forget it, we're not going to do anything unless we're forced to. And then they're working in a political climate that says that regulation isn't really needed, right? So their impediment is going to be a public pushback to this.
Well, with only about a minute left.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. And with a mixed bag of some hope, but some dire circumstances as well. I'm always thinking that there are going to be people watching and listening and who want to do something. So on that micro level, what can individuals do? I mean, if you save water in Washington, D.C., does that help people in New Mexico? I mean, what can people do on the micro level?
First,
we have about a minute left to share on this solution.
Go to circleofblue.org and get yourself, I mean, if you're an American, we have the best reporting on this in the world. So look at Circle of Blue, Choke Point US. And I think in the political structures is find candidates that are pragmatic and not ideological. We need pragmatism to solve these problems.
You sound frustrated, Keith.
But
Not
also
the only one. You speak for many Americans.
To plug their website, that they also, go take their water energy quiz. So you really start understanding the choices we make on energy have an impact on water and vice versa. And just to note that in China, that our research and reporting has been incredibly well received. The Wilson Center China Environment Forum, we're going to be going back, bringing the water and energy folks together, both U.S. and Chinese, to start getting both sides to start thinking about it, because there's potentially business opportunities, right, to water conservation,
well, that
clean
can move
energy.
some people who might not otherwise be moved. Well, thank you both for your work and for joining us today. We'll return next week with another edition of Dialogue. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Milewski. Thanks for joining us.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Radio and Television. Our host Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Milewski. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.